overview of the bones of the skull and a few tips and tricks before you take your test. So we'll start off with the ethmoid bone. There are only 4 terms you need to know on the ethmoid bone. From this frontal view, we can see inside the nose, the nasal concha are these bony structures here on the sides, and then in the middle, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And then from this photo, you can see the crista galli. It's this little crest right here, and then down lower, this would be the cribriform plate. You can see that better from a superior view of the floor of the skull. The frontal bone, again, only has 4 terms you need to know. The glabella right here between the eyebrows, the supraorbital foramen, supra meaning above, orbital of the eye, and foramen are just little holes, so supraorbital foramen. And then these ridges here, right where the eye sockets start, are called the supraorbital margin. And then right here, we have the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, and that's on both sides. That's right before the frontal bone meets the zygomatic bone. So it's called the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. The mandible has quite a few terms to know, but they're fairly straightforward. The alveolar process is just right here, where the bone meets the teeth. The angle of the mandible is this corner of your jaw that you can feel in the back. The body of the mandible is this front section here, basically where the teeth are, is the body of the mandible. Sometimes in the atlas, it'll show it from an anterior view, like from the front, and the body will be the only thing highlighted in that darker blue color, and then this all back here will be highlighted in the lighter blue. Be careful of that picture. A lot of people confuse it and think it's asking for the whole mandible when it's just highlighting the body of the mandible. The next one, the condylar process. It's this section of bone right before the mandibular condyles. So these little bulbous things on the ends, but right before that is the condylar process. And then these here, the pointier ones, are the coronoid processes. And then we have the mandibular notch, which is just this curve here in between those 2 processes. And then the mandibular symphysis is a faint line right here in the middle of the jaw where the 2 halves meet. The mandibular foramen are actually on the back. You can't see them in this photo. They're on the inside down here, kind of. But the mental foramen you can see on the front. This one's the only one visible in this picture, but there are 2 on the front. They are the mental foramen. And then lastly is the ramus of the mandible. It's just this section here, this kind of rectangle of the bone. Next is the maxilla. So the maxilla stretches from the nasal bone to the zygomatic bone and then all the way down to the teeth here. So that's the whole maxilla bone. The alveolar process of the maxilla, same with on the mandible. It's just right here, right before the teeth. The anterior nasal spine is this bump that sticks out here at the bottom of the nose. The frontal process of the maxilla is this section here right before we meet the frontal bone. So if we go back up to the frontal bone, this right here is the section before it meets the maxilla, and this is the section of the maxilla right before it meets the frontal bone. So it's called the frontal process of the maxilla. The infraorbital foramen are right here underneath the eye sockets. There's 2 of them. The palatine process you can see only from underneath. It's this big section right here, basically what you would call the roof of your mouth. The zygomatic process of the maxilla, just like the frontal process, except it's right before the maxilla meets the zygomatic bone, so we call it the zygomatic process of the maxilla. The occipital bone starts right here at the lambdoid suture and goes all the way down underneath here. So the external occipital protuberance, external meaning on the outside of the bone, occipital because it's on the occipital bone, and protuberance meaning it's just a bump. That's this right here. Sometimes you can feel it on the back of your skull. It's bigger on men than it is in women. I can't feel it on my skull, but you might be able to on yours. The foramen magnum is this big hole right here underneath the skull where your spinal cord comes through into your skull. The hypoglossal canal is kind of on the inside of the foramen magnum. It's tricky to see, but it's right where these little blue arrows are pointing to that highlighted little blue dot. There's a hole right there on both sides. It's called the hypoglossal canal. Now the nuchal lines I don't have a great picture of. There is a better picture in your atlas, but basically they would be right here. This line and this line. Occipital condyles are right next to the foramen magnum. They're these big bumps right here at the base of the skull. It's right where your atlas or your very first vertebrae sits, right there, right where your neck starts. So those are called the occipital condyles right here. Next we have the palatine bone. That includes the horizontal plate right here. Be careful not to get that confused with the palatine process, which is higher up. So we're just talking about this rectangle right here. It's the horizontal plate. And then on either side we have these little holes, which are called the palatine foramina. Foramina is just a plural version of the word foramen. And on the parietal bone, there's two parietal bones. So this is one of them. They're on either side of your skull. And on both of them, there are these ridges right here. It's pretty faint in this picture, but it's called the temporal lines, and it's where muscles come up from your jaw and attach to those right there.